Welcome, everybody, to the third episode of the Talk Freelance to Me podcast. I am so excited today because we have our very first guest, and she's very special to me and to the world. So I want to welcome Laura Figueroa Hernandez, Laura Figueroa Hernandez to English speakers to the show. Welcome. Thank you, Laura, for being here. I appreciate it so much. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm really thankful to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And, obviously, I really support what you're trying to do here, trying to help other women kind of tap into their own creative selves and, use that as a source of income. So anything, I can do to help, obviously, I'm here, and any knowledge that I can share in my experiences writing, obviously, I'm happy to share.
Thank you so much. So, for anybody that didn't see all my little promotional things, Laura is a White House correspondent for Newsday, which is a very respected New York-based outlet. And I want to read to you a little bit from her bio because she's accomplished a lot, and it's an honor to have someone of her level on my emerging podcast. So let me read a little bit. Laura Figueroa Hernandez is a White House correspondent for Newsday, a New York-based news outlet. She has covered both the Trump and Biden White Houses. Before joining Newsday's Washington bureau, Laura worked as a political reporter for the outlet for 5 years, covering everything from state to congressional races, New York City Hall, and the 2016 presidential campaign. Prior to Newsday, Laura worked as a staff reporter for the Miami Herald, which she dreamed of working for since high school. At the Herald, Laura started off as a local government reporter, but her reporter also took her to Haiti, Honduras, Cuba, and the U.S. Gulf Coast. Laura's first job in journalism was as a reporter for the Bradenton Herald in Southwest Florida. Her work covering the area's migrant farm worker community was awarded by the Florida Press Club and the Florida Society of Newspaper Editors. She is a proud graduate of the University of Florida's School of Journalism and Mass Communications and currently resides in Washington, D.C. with her husband and their 2 beautiful children. So thank you, Laura, for being here. I just got to say, there's people in the audience who know me. Laura's my best, dearest friend. So I got to be forthcoming and just say that she's one of the most special people to me. So it's extra special that she's here. And I have had the pleasure of knowing Laura since before the first day of our university experience, when we both were new J school kids. Do you remember that, Laura? What was your first impression of our program and us meeting?
So, just to let everyone know, yeah, literally, Ashley was like pretty much the first friend I made at UF, and it was just meant to be. We were actually part of a program for freshman minority journalism majors. They called us all into a big old auditorium, lots of empty seats. Obviously, not that many minority journalism freshmen. And Ashley sat right next to me, even though there was like a whole bunch of seats. But it was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. And, like Ashley said, we started off just, trying to get our clips into the local papers in Gainesville and just doing whatever we could to get, bylines and just clips to share and internships. And it's been a journey.
It really has been. And that's why, like, even just reading that bio just gives me chills. Before we got online, I was talking to Laura about just how I remember being friends with her, but also roommates in college, and seeing her get her first internship, putting her portfolio together for her first, she wrote for a college paper called the Gator Times and also the Independent Florida Alligator, and then getting her first job and even interning for People magazine, or I'm sorry, freelancing for People. That's something that stood out to me a lot because in our 20s, when everybody was going out on New Year's Eve for, to go out and party themselves, Laura would be going in Miami for People on behalf of People magazine and reporting. I mean, that's the level of dedication. When you read that bio and when you hear it and you hear these accolades, she worked her buns off a lot. So, and sacrificed a lot. So it's really special for me to just see that everything that you've achieved from this love of writing that started right when you were a little girl. Is that right? When you first wanted to be
Definitely.
a journalist?
Literally as far back as I can remember, I was always telling my parents, like, I want to be a journalist. I want to be a journalist. And I think a lot of that started with in my house, my parents were very strong newspaper readers, always brought home, the English language newspaper and the Spanish language newspaper. And so it was something that, me and my brother would always fight over once my dad got home, and we'd read the paper and we'd break up the sections. So I grew up with that love of like reading and getting to know the news and getting to know what was happening in the world. And right, and even just writing was just like always something that like, you know, just kind of made me feel comfortable. That's where I could express myself best. And so I've been very blessed and fortunate that I've had the opportunities that I've had. And I really appreciate what you're trying to do in terms of like, I think a lot of people like writing, love reading, want to write, want to be published, but they don't necessarily know like how to get started, or they don't necessarily think that they can. And it's great that you're showing them that there are opportunities out there. Just kind of have to like look for them and kind of know how to pitch yourself.
I love that. And you're the perfect person to teach the audience about pitching yourself, about pitching ideas. And I think they're really going to value the things that we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to go ahead. I had some questions prepared. So there's been a lot of misconceptions about the media. I feel like everybody says, oh, it's the media's fault for this and it's the media's fault for that. And I can't help, by being someone who was a newspaper reporter and worked in magazines, is feeling like, well, the media is us. The media reflects us, reflects what we're doing and what we're interested in and what we're paying attention to. So I always kind of chuckle about that. Thinking about, you talked about being a kid and from the beginning, being interested in news. Why politics? That's so interesting to me because politics, especially now, is such a, can be controversial. It can be a very taxing place, I think, to be in terms of reporting. Can you share what made you want to be a political journalist?
Sure. I think when you look at I look at politics in the term in like in the sense of people. What drew me to politics is because I was interested in the people who become politicians, right? Like what is your motivating factor? Like what is it that drives these people to run for public office, to put themselves out there? And oftentimes you see people with like earnest goals and earnest ambitions. I want to help my community. I want to do more for my people and where I live. And then sometimes that transitions into something else, and sometimes politicians kind of veer off course, or sometimes they just grow in power, and they are able to help their communities because they've been around longer. But I think at the core of it is just understanding people's motivations, for like helping one another. I genuinely do think that a lot of people get into politics because they want to help people, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't just kind of like throw yourself into the public sphere and kind of put all your business out there if you don't have some sort of underlying desire to help your community or help your state or help whatever it is that you're representing. And so I think that's kind of like what drew me to politics. And also just what drew me to politics is because politics is government, right? And so when you're looking at how this world works and how people get help, it's through their government, most of the times, right? And so who are the people who are controlling the purse strings of these programs that help people? Who are the people that are making the decisions that can help or hinder people? So I think that's kind of like how I got into it, and how I still try to kind of like view it through that lens.
I love that. I love that. A lot of times, people want to plug their ears and not listen, and they get turned off. They get turned off with fighting with their relative on Facebook about different political ideas and things. But we have to pay attention, right? Like we can't complain about things happening in our country or our city, or we'll talk about politics being local in a minute, but we have to we don't have that privilege to kind of tune out. We have to pay attention. And so I'm thankful to journalists like you who keep people honest and are keeping track and are watching these things on behalf of the rest of us. So tell us about this job, because I see your Instagram and these snapshots from inside the White House and from our beautiful nation's capital. What does it mean to be a White House correspondent? Can you tell us about a day in the life of a White House correspondent?
Sure. So obviously it's something that I carry with great gratitude, and it's something that I feel very like privileged about. So there's not a day that I kind of go on into the White House where I take it for granted. Like, every day I'm like, this is a great honor. Not that many people have like the badge they can flash to get in here, right? Who have the clearance to get in here. And so basically, the first couple of days, the first couple of months when I was on the job back in 2018, it was very nerve-wracking, but I've kind of like steadily, like, it's become a more comfortable place, like, because it is such a small place. I think a lot of people see the White House on TV and they see the briefing room that's set up like on TV in terms of like other like TV shows, and they think the briefing room is like this huge place, and it's really not. It's just really confined quarters, and the whole like White House press briefing area, where there's like little desks in the back, it's all very like cramped. But it's also like, because it's such close quarters, is a great opportunity to like meet other journalists, and like get to kind of like pick their ear, some of the best journalists in the country, veteran journalists. So any opportunity I have to kind of like talk to folks who've kind of been around longer than me, in terms of political reporting, in terms of White House reporting, I take advantage of that. Um, but Ashley, like, any day in journalism is never the same. One day you're going in and there's really like nothing happening, and then some days it's like the sky is falling.
Mm.
What I do appreciate about different administrations have different approaches, but the White House can be a place where you you're walking into the briefing room, and then you'll see like an official or even like a secretary or somebody like kind of walking in that driveway heading towards the different cameras where they have their TV hits and stuff. And you can like, a lot of times like reporters will then like approach them. And so it's like somewhere where you're able to ask questions on behalf of your audience. Like, you have, like the Secretary of Transportation in front of you. You're able to
Wow.
like tap him and be like, hey, I have this question about the Gateway Tunnel program, project in New York or New Jersey. Um, so I think like that's the great thing about like living in a democracy, right? Like, these folks
Mm.
are supposed to answer to the people, not just the people who voted for them, but just to like everyone, right? And so that's our jobs as journalists, is to like make sure that we can get what we can out of them. And obviously, like, every administration, every politician is going to have their agenda and want to kind of like say things or spin things, right, in a
Mhm.
direction that's favorable for them. And obviously it's your job as a journalist to try to get like as much as you can to present it to your audience in a way that they have more context, so that it's not just like, oh, I'm just transcribing, what this person told me,
Mm.
but I'm giving you the full picture. Like, okay, the secretary said this, but here's what people on the ground are saying about XYZ,
Mm.
and here's what experts are saying. And so I try also just in my reporting to just tap into like as many people as I can. And so I know I'm kind of like rambling here, but it's it's awesome that we live in a country, right, that we're able to do these things, or we're able to like report on the government freely, and openly.
Absolutely. I think about that every, Independence Day. And especially like in the last couple years, there's been so many things, so many unprecedented things that have happened, and it's easy to point out these negative things. But I'm always grateful to my grandparents and my ancestors for coming to this country, because that what you hit the nail on the head. There's some countries where you don't question who's in charge. You
Right,
can't
right,
question. And certainly not people like me and you, women, moms, we don't
right,
get that chance. So
right.
that's to me journalism and democracy. I mean, it's those they're hand in hand. They work hand in hand. So I
Right,
appreciate that.
definitely, definitely.
So have you, and I know you were mentioning that you worked for both administrations. So do you, I can only imagine things that you've seen and how days have gone left, fast. Can you share maybe a memorable moment from your experience thus far being in this role?
Oh, there's just so many.
I'm
um
sure.
I know. And I'm just trying to think. I feel like my years covering the Trump administration were just
Hmm.
like one big blur.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it was actually, you know, I don't even know how to say this, but I guess there's two memories that stick out. One, was during the pandemic, right? Being able there was, obviously the big scare, like
Hmm.
everyone was glued to their TV, everybody was glued to these briefings and trying to make sense of what this virus meant to everybody. And so the briefing room obviously like could not have the same protocols as before. We couldn't fill in all the seats. And so it got to a point where there was only 14 reporters allowed for each briefing, right? And so we were on a rotation. And so I just remember like the weight of that, right? Like knowing that, you're only one of 14 for that day. You better make sure to have like good questions because you have to make it count, right? For the rest
Mm.
of your colleagues, because there's people out there who are trying to figure out what this pandemic, what this coronavirus means. And I remember being just at several of those coronavirus briefings with the president, um, with Dr. Fauci, with Vice President Pence at one point. Like there was different ones, but with Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, and being able to ask those questions. And obviously, like there's always going to be debate about the information that came out of those briefings.
Hmm.
Just the ability that we had to like at least keep it going. The White House Correspondents Association fought very hard to make sure that those briefings could continue because, the White House could have very easily been like, no, it's a pandemic, it's a public emergency, we can't have people in a confined space. But like they figured out a way to make it work because they wanted, to have this ability to inform the public daily about like what was happening. So that's just, one thing that stuck out. And the other was having the ability during the Trump administration. I'm part of a New York based paper, and so me and other regional reporters, so reporters who don't report for like the big national papers like the Washington Post, New York Post, we got invited to like sit down with the president, kind of ask questions that were like specific to our state. And I'll give him that. Like he was there for like an hour and he talked to us and he knew about a lot of these things, and whatever he didn't know about, he had his aides kind of like
Mm.
look into it. And so it was just the fact, like being able to be in the Oval Office with the president at the time, and it was a pretty cool moment.
That's amazing. Like to just be around that much history. And it will be, years from now until we're able to look, historians will look upon this, journalists, talking heads will look back upon this season that we've been in. And it will be interesting to kind of see, to be able to say, for you to be able to say, I was there, in there. Like that's really special. I love that.
Feel
So
blessed.
yeah, and so we talked on the onset that we met, before the first day of school. We didn't just meet in college; we met before the first day. So when to be able to grow up and to see, to witness, your trajectory, that's been so special. You've been able to survive in journalism, which in itself is not an easy industry, right? I remember being in college when we were both in college together and talking to other people who were studying healthcare or engineering, and they were getting paid to
Right.
intern, right? And they were getting apartments and
Right.
fellowships, and for us it was like, no, you got to work for free for several internships
Right.
just to even get an interview for a paid gig, and then we'll see
Right.
how you do and we'll see if you survive. So
Right.
you've been able to survive in this industry, but also survive in the midst of a lot of economic challenges.
Right.
What has been your secret and your commitment? Because there's a lot of folks who I know. I remember when we were in college, they would say they went to the dark side, right? They were journalists and then they went to PR because journalism is not easy. It's not easy,
Right.
especially for you as a wife, a mom now. How have you been able to not just survive in journalism with all of these challenges, but also thrive to the level where you're at now?
Well, I definitely think you have to be kind of flexible. Times have changed, obviously, like you said, especially because of economic pressures, especially economic pressures on newspapers. So, I grew up with the dream of like, I'm going to work at the New York or at the Miami Herald, and that's where I'm going to build my career. And I'm
Yeah.
like editor of the Miami Herald and work my way up. And that was my dream for the longest. And then, I was working at the Herald. It was a dream job. I worked with amazing people, but I saw, it's like people were being laid off and we kept having furloughs. And so I kept thinking to myself, like, is this kind of like where you want to be? Does this newspaper have kind of like an economic plan, to
Mm.
kind of get through these storms, or are you just kind of like waiting to be like the next on chopping block? And so I kind of told myself like, you can't wait, you can't wait to make somebody for somebody to make the decision for you. And so I think a lot of that in journalism, you kind of have to know that, that there is the possibility that maybe your outlet is not always going to do the best economically or profit wise or whatever. And so, does that mean you should jump from place to place? Not necessarily. For me, I use that as an opportunity to, once I saw that things were kind of getting like tough at the Miami Herald, I started to think to myself, like, well, what do you want to do? Where do you want to be? Where do you see yourself? And part of me thought, well, I'm young. At that time, I was unmarried. I was without kids. I could kind of move freely. And I thought, I want to go back to New York. Like, I grew up in New York as a kid. I want to go to New York and just kind of like try it on for size and see how I do there, get that out of my, do the whole like I love New York bit. And that's why I applied for Newsday, and I've been very blessed that they were hiring. And also it's like looking at the viability of the outlets that you're working for. Newsday at the time had just been purchased by a local owner. He was very loyal to Newsday because he grew up on Long Island. And so he's somebody who has Pat Dolan, who has like, you know, committed. He's put his money where his mouth is. He's very like Newsday means something to him. He grew up with it, and so he's not like laying off reporters in mass. He's kind of investing in the product, and so that's kind of like what has kept me there as long. But even there, like, I started off as a county government reporter, and then kind of just rolled with the punches. Like, hey, Laura, do you want to go cover, it's the 2016 presidential race, or at the time it was the primaries. And so, you had Trump running, you had Hillary Clinton running. And at the time, the Republican primary was fuller, right? There was Ted Cruz, there was John Kasich. And so they were all coming into New York in April. And so it was like, hey, we need somebody who can like go to all these events. And I was like, me, send me.
Wow.
So kind of making yourself available and being that person who's like, yes, I will do this. I will spend however much time, how many hours. And then that led to like, okay, well, now Trump and Hillary Clinton are the nominees and they're New York people. Let's follow them on the trail. And then like one thing led to the other. And then all of a sudden I'm at the White House. So I like to think that like when opportunities come your way, sometimes you can't say yes to everything. I'm learning that too. But as many times as possible, I try to say yes, because you never know what the next thing will lead to, right? So
That's amazing. You have worked really hard. And people don't understand that. I think when they see successful people, you think, oh, she was lucky. And it's like, we can say blessed, right? But you worked in accordance with those blessings, right? You worked for it. That's amazing. So I talked to a lot of freelance writers, some freelance journalists, and a lot of bloggers. And there's been interest, I think, since that election that in 2016 or the years before. People have become very interested in commentary, in politics, and I think that's a great thing. What tips do you have for, say, somebody listening to this who's interested in writing about politics? How can they get started in this area?
I think, like I mentioned about like the state of where kind of newspapers and local outlets are, a lot of them are starving for reporters, right? So they're not necessarily going to hire like a reporter who they're going to have to like give insurance to and do all these things and 401k, but they are in the market for freelancers and for stringers and for people who can like cover things that maybe they can't always get to. Like I remember at the Miami Herald, they had a pretty deep bench of like freelancers or so-called stringers who they could like rely on, and most newspapers do, right? They rely on freelancers and stringers to get to things that maybe their staff writers can't get to. So I think one thing is, if you have an interest in politics or government or any sort of even just like newspaper reporting, would be to reach out to your local newspaper, open up the paper, look at the masthead, see who's the editor, managing editor, news editor, and most times like their contact information is on there. Reach out to them, send them your clips, send them your resume and say, hey, I'm interested in some freelance writing and looking for opportunities. I think that's kind of, a first step to kind of like build a relationship and see what's out there. I also think, you don't necessarily have to look to the traditional newspaper, right?
Mm.
There's a lot of people like yourself too, right? Like you're starting your kind of like your media venture. You have your podcast, you have your Instagram and your profile. And some of the journalists that I know at the White House have actually gotten their start by like building an audience for themselves. Like, I'll give you an example. There's this kid. He's a kid out of high school. He was in St. Louis. He started this newsletter called and now I'm blanking out. He started a newsletter about politics, like the daily politics email newsletter. And this was before newsletters became like a big thing. And so he'd just send like a roundup. And all of a sudden he's getting like people from the New York Times and like the Washington Post writing about him because he got so many subscribers because that's what people wanted, right? Just like a newsletter, something with all the daily headlines, something just like easy nuggets to digest. This kid built like an audience of like thousands of subscribers. And then he parlayed that. He was in high school, but he became like, all these newspapers profiled him. And so he was able to like interview like the presidential candidates and because he's young, right? But he was able to kind of carve out a niche for himself. His name is Gabriel, I think, Schwartz. I'll get that name for you, but
Awesome.
um, Gabe Fleischman, sorry. Again, started off as a high schooler. He's now at Georgetown University, I think. And he has a White House, he gets into the White House now. He gets credentialed because he kind of built this audience for himself. He was able to make the case to the White House. Look, I have I report on politics. I have an audience and, he's able to get in there. And so just don't limit yourself. Like if it's something that you're passionate about, politics or whatever the case may be, maybe that's the way to go too, is, think about uh, carving out your own niche online, right? Making a blog about what's happening in your community, building an audience in that sense, and then kind of taking it from there.
I love that. That's a great story. And I think, with that, there's so much opportunity, but there's also some things to keep in mind, particularly because this space has, there's more people competing to have their voices heard, and everybody wants to be first. And social
Mhm.
media is, we want information, we want new information, we want it right now. And
Right,
so, with that, sometimes the facts get a little muddled.
right.
As someone who went to J school, who has a degree, who studied this in the academic sense and mastered it, can you give some advice to independent writers about fact checking? How do you approach this as a professional?
Well, obviously, it's like the core of what I do. And obviously, for anybody who is looking into freelancing, you want to make sure because your name is everything, right? Your credibility is everything. So, one false, flag of like bad information in your story, like then that kind of like weighs heavily on your credibility kind of moving forward. When I'm thinking about fact checking, it's easy to just go into Google, right? Like, oh, let me fact check this fact. But nowadays, it's, there is, like you mentioned, so much misinformation, so many like pseudo blogs and pseudo websites, and you don't
Mm-hmm.
know what to check. So, a lot of times, rely on the sources that just like, start with the basics, just like you learned in school, right? You start with the basics of like sources of information, newspapers, academic journals, things like that to kind of corroborate whatever it is that you're reporting. A lot of times what I do is I rely on like university professors or if I'm like unsure about something, what I like to say is like, I'll call the experts up, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
figure out like who are the people in this field who can like explain something to you. I'll give you an example. Last week I had to do a story about the Trump indictment in Manhattan, right? The former president being indicted in Manhattan court. This is the first time this has ever happened. I'm not a court reporter. I don't know anything about like legal jargon and legal implications. I'm a political reporter. I'm good at that, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So I called different um, former prosecutors, attorneys, university constitutional law professors, because they're the ones who are like steeped in this. They know these issues and they can kind of explain it to you in layman terms because that's their job, right?
Right.
Explain it to their students. So if you have that opportunity to like, And a lot of times, like, I know you think like, oh, I'm a freelancer, I can't just call up a professor, but you can call the university like media relations line and say, hey, I'm a freelancer, I'm writing a piece for XYZ outlet. The piece is regarding this. Do you have any experts in this field? And like 9 times out of 10, like I think they're willing to help you because they want to like put their university out there. They want to like have that good public relations of like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, our expert was quoted in this piece, or helped give context to this piece. So just in fact checking, I would just say like just be cautious of your
Mm-hmm.
sources, right? Like do your due diligence, but also make sure that your whatever you're kind of like fact checking against is coming from a credible source.
So good and so important. And so, I mean, the tip about calling the media relations, I think that that is so key. That's their job. That's why they exist, is to be the intermediary between the public and the team at the university. So love
Right.
that. So how can independent reporters and writers generate new ideas and enterprise their own stories from their local communities? How can they dig for story angles without just looking at press releases that they receive?
Definitely. Well, one place to start is if you live in a certain community and you feel like there's certain things that aren't being covered, or maybe you're curious about the community you live in, it all goes through like your local government, whether that's your town council, city council, town commission, like they all have different names, but just start local, right? Whether it's your commission, committee, whatever it's called, assembly. And they normally meet like once or twice a month, and they normally put their agendas online and look through the agendas, and maybe there's some things you don't understand, but you can always like call the town or public information officer and say, I'm a citizen, I don't understand what this agenda item means, can you explain it to me? And then kind of like take it from there. So I always look at like meeting agendas as a great opportunity to like find different
Mm.
things. Like I remember when I was kind of like a municipal reporter, just looking, sometimes it's like it's not even like big ticket items, but like you'll find like a great story, and like um there's like different parts of meetings where like people get commendations and things like that, and you like see certain people are being honored in your community, and you're like, wow, like why hasn't anybody written about this person? They have like an amazing story. And so there's just like a lot of opportunities in itself within like an agenda. Believe me, I know it sounds like boring, but there are opportunities there. And I think just kind of like going out to events and seeing things for yourself and things that you're curious about. I remember when I worked at the Herald, and I kind of had this gig. It was called General Assignment, and basically it was like you're supposed to figure out story ideas. Like it could be
Mm.
anything, right? I wasn't tethered to like a town or a municipality. And I was like, oh my God, that's so broad. I don't know what to do. But I just started to think about things that I was curious about. Like at the time, I
Mm.
was in my 20s, and that was like when the whole Twilight era was like big. And so I was like, I'm curious about like, and then so I heard that there was like all these people who like identify as like vampires. And I was like, I was just curious about that, right? Like, who are these people who like identify as vampires, and they like get their teeth like prosthetically like fixed or whatever? And
Wow.
so then like I started Googling, and then I found out there was like a party of these people, and I went with one of our friends, Cynthia, to this party, and it was like full of like people dressed as vampires, and they had the fangs and everything, like and just like approaching them like, hey, I'm a reporter, and I'm curious about this. Like, would you like to, can you, would you be okay with me interviewing you like after this party, like somewhere else? And I found like people who were, and it made for like a really interesting story just about like this kind of
Yeah.
like subculture of people. So, you know, one of the things is if you're curious about something, or if you're interested in something, like follow that, pursue it, see like where it leads. It could be a story, it could be a story that you pitch.
That is amazing. I love that. I want to read that. I'm going to have to go back into your
Yeah,
archives
it's one
and
of my
read that.
favorite stories,
And you know what?
honestly.
Yeah, life's short. If you want to be a vampire, be a
Right. It's
vampire.
not even like, I know people think like, oh, journalists have to be all serious and stuff, but it was,
Right.
it was in the Metro section of Miami Herald, and like, and it was a human interest story. It was about
Absolutely.
there are these people who identify as this, and like here's where they go party, and here's like there's like dental, dentists who specialize in like helping them get their teeth fixed or whatever to have
So
fangs.
amazing.
Just you're supposed to have fun too with like writing, right? So with
Yes.
freelancing, whether it's freelancing or wherever, like just have fun. Be
I
curious.
love that. I love that. And thinking about these stories and that need, right, to turn something in, to generate your own story, it just made me think about, your job. You can't say to your boss, hey, I had writer's block and I can't meet my deadline.
Yeah.
You write a lot, you produce a lot, and you have to do it by these critical deadlines. Do you have any secrets or tips that you can share with our audience on how do you produce so much? How do you write more efficiently so that you can meet these deadlines and these goals?
So I think, when I first started out in journalism, especially like in my 20s, I was like so attached to like everything I wrote, right? Like, so it would
Right.
take me forever to write something because I'd be like, no, that word doesn't belong there. No. And I think like as I've gone along, sometimes I've realized like, you know what, Laura, not every story is going to be like, the great American epic piece of journalism. Like sometimes you just need to like crank it out. And so it's just, like a lot of it is just like getting out of your own head and being like,
Mm.
you know what, like just power through it. Like it
Mm.
may look clunky right now, but just get whatever's in your head, just get it down, and then you can kind of go fix things later. I also have like a different writing process than most people. Like
Mm.
some people will like start off with their lead and then they do like the middle of their story and then they do their end. And sometimes like when I'm stuck on a lead where I'm like, I don't even know how to like start this piece, I'll start with like what I do know, right? Like, so I'll
Mm.
say, well, I have a lot on, this part about like, let's say Trump's indictment. I
Mhm.
spoke to this lawyer and he told me a lot about like the constitutional implications. So let me just start with that section. And then I find that like I have written this whole section. I'm like, oh, okay, good. It puts me in a better zone. I'm like, all right, I
Mhm.
have 200 to 300 words down now. I have some sort of shape. And you know what? I could put that in my lead, something about this and then mix it with that. So it's like sometimes I just find like writing what you have will help like kind of guide you in terms of like what else do you need, what else do you feel to kind of complete the story. And then another thing is just, I remember like one of my like journalism mentors, she mentioned to me like that another editor had told her sometimes like when you haven't written in a while, right? Like your brain is like, I don't know how to write, and you have to sit down and
Yes.
write something. So she was like, you just have to like do it quick and dirty. It's like sometimes like all it takes is doing like something small, like a small piece of writing to get those like creative muscles moving again. So for example, let's say you have like a big freelance project that you're due in 2 days and you're like, I haven't gotten started on it, or you're like my brain is fried or whatever. Try something small, even if it's something like writing a letter to like a family member, or writing, I don't know, like just something else, right? Like in journalism, like I would write like maybe like a 10-inch story. Oh, let me just cover that. Let me just write that quick story about the city council meeting I went to.
Mhm.
Then all of a sudden I find that like by writing that small story, I got that out of the way and like my brain is like revved up again. So that's just kind of like another thing that might work for people.
I love that. That is so good. So I've kept you a long time. I want to thank you so much for all of the advice and inspiration that you've given to our audience. Really, really appreciate it. What's next for you? What are you looking for? What's your dream? Where do you see your career going next?
That's an interesting question because you know me, like I've always wanted to be a journalist, and I've just kind of learned that like you don't necessarily need to glue yourself to like one goal or one thing, because like I said, like when I was starting off after college, when I got my job at the Miami Herald, I was like, I'm here, I made it, I'm done, I'm here. And I would have stayed there, obviously, but like, sometimes I think about it. Like, I'm like, what would have happened if I would have stayed there? Would I be at the White House now? So it's like I've learned that like right now I'm at the White House, like I'm working for a paper that I really like value, that treats me well. And so like I'm kind of like leaning into that. And I don't know what comes next because, sometimes you kind of like need to leave it to chance, right? Or see what other opportunities come up. But like, I don't want to ever say like, well, then this is the next goal. And so, hopefully like your readers too can or your audience can like see that like, you're, especially with freelancing, you could kind of like go where you want and see,
Mm.
make it work for you. And you don't have to be like tethered to like one thing or one dream or whatever.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, Laura. This has been such a great conversation. Where can people find you online if they want to follow your reporting and learn more about your work?
Sure. So if if you're interested in my political reporting, you can go newsday.com. And I believe they have like all my articles under newsday.com/Laura. Or you can find me on social media on Twitter at Laura, Laura underscore Figueroa, Figueroa.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We'll go ahead and let you go now. We appreciate your time. Thank you for being on the Talk Freelance to Me podcast.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate this.